You're listening to Scheduling Sin with me, Snowmill.
Okay, the media says threesomes are like this.
Right.
Let's speak with some people who've actually had them and see, well, is it like the media suggests or is it something different?
Wasn't that great? I don't need to do it again. No, no, no. You should definitely do it again. Hello, sinners. Mr. Snow here. We want to try something different on this episode. We love to laugh. We love to tell stories, but in this episode, we wanted to bring to you some of the scientific background of the swinging lifestyle. We found an article that was co-written by Dr. Ryan Scoats about receiving medical health care as a lifestyler. And that's a topic that's particularly important to us and to all swingers, really, because let's face it, we all need to be doing testing. We all need to be careful about our health, and how we incorporate all of that with our physician is a really important conversation. To that end, we found an article co-written by Dr. Ryan Scoats. Ryan Scoats earned his BA and Master's of Research from the University of Bath and his PhD from the University of Winchester, studying under Professor Eric Anderson. He's currently a lecturer in sociology at Birmingham City University, and much of his work focuses on people's experience of mixed-sex threesomes. Utilizing a sociological perspective, his threesome research aims to fill a gap in academic knowledge around group sex, as well as reducing the stigma around this behavior and encouraging more open and honest dialogues around sexual desires. We sat down with Dr. Scoats. Let's listen to what he had to say. So, Dr. Scoats, let's start here. You did your PhD on a study about threesomes. What led you to study consensual non-monogamy?
Yeah, let's not do non-consensual.
The non-consensual is less fun.
That's way less
Yeah,
fun.
yeah, that's a different podcast, I think. So it, like so many threads of research and seeds of sort of ideas, it came from personal experience. So I had my own threesome earlier in life, and it didn't turn out how I thought it was going to. I assumed it was going to be this one-time thing, and we ended up meeting this person a few more times, and we'd go out for the day and enjoy ourselves, do what friends do, and we were also having sex as well. So the three of us, and eventually it kind of petered out, and it got me thinking. This is not what I thought it would be. I wonder how common my experience is, and so. I was kind of on my way to graduate school at that point, and so I started to look at the academic literature because the only other alternatives were just media pieces, and a lot of them are quite, very sensationalist, I would
Right.
say, and so I didn't really feel like I was going to get any insight from those pieces. So I went to the academic literature, and my experience wasn't represented there either, and I was quite surprised that there weren't many studies about threesomes out there. And so I thought, well, this would be a really good focal point of my PhD to try and understand what do your quote unquote regular people do when they have threesomes? What experiences do they have? The only real study at that time was a book from the sort of late 80s, where the research had been conducted by a psychoanalyst, Arno Carlin. And he collected this data over the 60s and 70s, and he'd spoken with his patients and swingers. And I was like, okay, that is interesting, but there's lots of other people out there having threesomes as well. It's not just swingers. Like I myself am not a swinger, and I've had a threesome. So I wanted to understand, what do your regular people who are not doing these things all the time or don't have these options, how do they have threesomes? What does it mean to them? What are their experiences like? And so, yeah, I just kind of entered that rabbit hole, as it were.
You mentioned that, well, two questions I have. One is, you mentioned that you are not a swinger, but occasionally you are having threesomes. In your perspective, what's the definitional difference between a swinger and a person who has threesomes?
So I guess it's kind of a tricky one, and people are going to define things differently. Um, I think it's going to be down to the personal. I would imagine swingers and people who swing. Well, that in itself is kind of an element to it. Do you define it as kind of a part of you and who you are and your identity, or is it this thing? Is it this behavior that you do?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we can think about how regular you do it. Do you attend special events, special clubs? Do you have a network of other people who are happy to swing with you or understand and can refer you to other people or whatnot? So that is more so kind of a swinging network from my understanding and from what I've read. Whereas a threesome can happen to anyone. Like in any room, there's going to be people who have had threesomes, but you're probably not going to say the same for swingers, although you never know. It depends what room you're in.
What you mentioned that your experience was not well represented by the literature that you found.
Mhm.
What were the differences?
I think for most of the things that I found, it was talking about open relationships, it was talking about swinging, it was talking about polyamory. It was
Yeah.
all of these things that had a bit more permanence to them. It was kind of like threesomes were this stepping stone, or threesomes opened the door for people going into other things. It was never sort of spoken about as this thing in and of itself that people might do, and then they might never go on to do anything else. It was also spoken about as it tended to be kind of one-time experiences or one-time things. And we had this thing that had gone on a couple of times, but it hadn't led to us bringing this person into our relationship or us going on to do other things. And it was like, okay, I wonder how many other people like me there are out there with sort of an experience that doesn't map to this well-trodden path, or the well-trodden path that the media and some of the research would kind of lead you to believe.
So you did this as a single person or with your partner?
It was with my partner at the time.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Well, and I think what's interesting about it is, you made a statement about like a stepping stone, and that's kind of interesting because I think for us, we talk a lot about kind of our journey starting with this fantasy, right, and
Uh-huh.
this idea of, oh, this would be really hot to do this with a third person, and then starts the journey and the evolution of all the things that we've done. And you also said something about, when you identify, um, when you talk about, and we've talked about that with language related to referring to it as the lifestyle versus we have some friends of ours that refer to it as the naughty hobby, right? And because
Hmm.
it's not, they don't identify like they're so much more than just in the lifestyle. They don't find it to be a
Yeah,
lifestyle per se. They find it as something that they enjoy doing, just an activity.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so that's really interesting. I have to really kind of chew on that, but because I don't know if I would
yeah.
identify necessarily that way, but I would say it's definitely something that we enjoy doing and we do, but it's not, doesn't define us.
For sure. And I think you can see this in all kind of forms of life, in all areas of interest. Like if you take, I play board games.
Yeah.
So I would probably identify as a board gamer, but other people would say, oh, yeah, no, I play board games. So I guess it's how central it is to your sense of self,
Yeah.
or how much of your time it occupies, how much you think about it. And it's goes
Well,
towards that construction of your identity and understanding of who you are.
if it's how much bandwidth it takes, that's going to be that's a different conversation, specifically related to Mr. Snow.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what did your PhD research determine
Well,
about
first of all,
threesomes?
how did you go about doing this? And like when you went to your advisor and you said, "Hey, this is what I want to study." Was this, were there other people in your cohort that, like were doing similar things, or that's just it's a it's a unique topic, right? So,
Yeah, yeah. There was no one kind of going as deeply into the kind of sex arena as
yeah.
I was. I think I've always been quite happy to push the envelope and
Hmm.
sort of have these difficult discussions or touch upon areas that perhaps no one else is willing to. And, I quite like that. I am comfortable talking about these things.
Hmm.
And, many years ago, I think we're a lot more open now as in sort of Western culture, but many years ago it was much more constrained. And so I've always been happy to be one of the people open to having honest conversations about these things in a kind of non-judgmental way.
Hmm.
And so I was quite happy to approach my supervisor, and being the guy that he is, sort of even more open than I was, he was like, that's a great idea. You
Yeah.
could really kind of make something out of that. Um, and yeah, it kind of spiraled from there. It was in terms of what I did. So it was mainly interview based, and it was mainly through word of mouth. So I think now our online infrastructures are much more developed. You can interview over Zoom. These things weren't really available in
Right.
the same way. So it was a lot of meeting people at parties, meeting people out and about, referral friends from friends, even some like connections through family members.
Oh,
That was how I got people. So
What was your
it was
thesis?
so it was very exploratory. I wanted to understand how do people without pre-established networks, so people who are sort of polyamorous or who are swingers, how do these people find having threesomes? So what does it mean to them? What do they think about them? How does it impact their relationship if they have one? Um, what does the experience mean? Does it change their understanding of relationships or sex or monogamy? So it was just really trying to paint a picture of, okay, the media says threesomes are like this.
right.
Let's speak to some people who've actually had them and see, well, is it like the media suggests or is it something different?
And when was this? How long ago was your PhD, like this research?
So I finished in 2017.
Okay, so it wasn't too long ago, but it long enough. Yeah.
So what did you find
Yeah.
out?
Um, Maybe a bit of a cop-out answer, but threesomes are complicated.
No kidding.
What?
Yeah, yeah.
Mind blown.
Um, so I I like to sort of paint the picture of threesomes in many ways it's no different from two people having sex.
Yeah.
The reasons why two people have sex are numerous. So you might be horny, you might be bored, you might be um, turned on, you might be doing it to make your partner happy, you might be doing it because the opportunity's there, because you're drunk, because it'll make you feel attractive, because it'll give you a feeling of power or empowerment.
Yeah.
Um, and threesomes are sort of no different. So the reason why people have threesomes are hugely varied, and they vary from encounter to encounter, person to person, relationship and couple. Yeah, it's as complicated as two-person sex in terms of people's motivations. So I think I really want to dispel this myth that there was one particular experience that people had when they had threesomes. It wasn't the breaker of relationships, or it wasn't necessarily the pinnacle of one's fantasy and it all played out in a particular way. There was so much variety and diversity in it. So I'd say that is probably the biggest thing. And then there's, smaller elements like a lot of what allowed people or the people that I spoke to have threesomes seem to be um, putting themselves in places and positions where vulnerability was reduced.
Huh.
So, they might be drunk, and drunk can provide you with a social shield. It gives you an excuse. So, if you say, "Oh, I had a threesome to someone, but I was really drunk," you can excuse your behavior to
Right.
someone who doesn't like it, or excuse it to yourself if you're a little bit embarrassed about
Right.
it. But it kind of allows you to do it. Or if you're doing it with friends, there's reduced vulnerability. You maybe know these people,
Hmm.
you know what they're going to be like. You feel a bit more comfortable about saying, "Don't want to do that. Could we stop and do this?" Those sorts of things. So that was also an interesting finding. Yeah, but I could talk all day on threesome.
Did you did you have a I mean, how many people did you interview, and were these people that had like male male female, male female female? I mean, like, did you have kind of a good variety of different types as far as people that did it kind of on an isolated or once or twice versus people that sought that behavior out?
So initially I did 28 interviews with people, and then this was supplemented with another 30 interviews with college-aged men, and about a third of them had had threesomes, and then further supplemented with about 200 qualitative surveys,
Yeah.
so asking, how did your last threesome come about? Why did you have it? What happened? So with the interviews, it tended to be people had had either one or two or 5 or 10, they would sort of, it was either just a one-time thing or they'd had quite a
Or
few.
they've had multiple.
With the surveys, it really ranged from, 1 to people saying hundreds, lost count. Yeah.
For the people that had a lot of them, were they more likely to have been with the same partners in all those cases, or were they more likely to have had a lot of threesomes with a lot of different partners?
I think it varied, and sexuality plays a key role in this as well. So I also had a data set of gay men, or I should say men who have sex with men. So bi men, gay men, straight men, but still having sex with men.
Right.
So in their threesomes, it was not necessarily as connected to having a partner. And interestingly, there, threesomes no longer were this big thing. It was just another option on the menu of sex. And so when asking, why did you have your last threesome? It's like, well, why not?
Because we were there, and it just right. Like that's what I ordered on the menu for that day. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Or someone's like, well, why does anyone have sex?
But what's so interesting?
Sorry.
But it's just interesting because we talked a little bit this afternoon about the sexuality piece of it and how, like, I think, and again, this is a generalized statement. I have no research, but my opinion, I guess, or my thought would be, people that are in like the LGBTQ community tend to be more sexual or tend to be much more open about their sexuality and sexual experiences versus, like 40-year-old white people who like maybe a little more, I don't know, calculated
reserved
about it. Yeah.
I think if you're in like an LGBT community, or if you're on an app that caters for it, say if you're on Grindr, then you've already reduced one of the potential barriers. If you have a mixed grouping, there's the immediate questions of, okay, is everyone okay doing stuff with everyone, or is that going to be an issue? And that can lead to issues in and of itself. Like if people aren't happy about interacting with everyone, that can create certain power dynamics.
Right.
Whereas if that question is just, it's not out of the mix, but it's more likely that everyone is going to be at least of a similar sexuality or interested in the same kind of body parts, at least. If you have a network that allows for that. And, I had data where gay men were saying, oh, yeah, I just get offered them on Grindr all the time.
Right.
It's just, just ping, ping, ping. Yeah, fancy a threesome. Or someone might be chatting with someone who they've had a hookup with before, and someone new gets interested. And they're like, you know what? I'm talking with someone. Should we make this a three-way? And it's just so much easier.
Well, it is just really interesting. I think there's a lot of layers to that, I think. I think how men in general view sex plays into it, and it tends to be the more physical, right? As opposed to women who tend to be a little bit more emotional. Now, even involved with the lifestyle and swinging, like we've engaged in threesomes, and it has been very much just about sex. But even still, it's a thing that we do together. It's not a thing that I do or he does necessarily. Like when we engage in that, it's something that we do together for us, if that makes sense, which is different, I think, than like a single male going out, like a gay male going out and doing that.
Well, absolutely.
In most threesomes, there's one person who is not part of the relationship ordinarily. So, I think it's kind of interesting to consider how that person approaches the same sexual experience would be somewhat different maybe than how the couple might approach the same sexual experience. And I think a lot of that dictates the roles that each person plays. It's very common in our experience when it's a female and two males, that the male who is not part of the couple feels an obligation to be a support person, if you will. That person has an obligation to sort of be the element that the couple wants, right? So that the couple drives that. Whereas if, it's three people who are not in a relationship, the dynamic in that same sexual encounter would be really quite different.
Well, it's much more self-serving. Yeah.
I think that's kind of fascinating. But let me ask you this. So what other kinds of research, now that we've moved on from your threesome thesis, what other kinds of research in consensual non-monogamy are you working on now?
So most recently, so I've done a bit of general writing, sort of giving overviews of the area, but most recently I've conducted work into consensual non-monogamy and sexual healthcare.
Yeah.
So looking at how people find sexual healthcare, what their experiences are, like do they trust their healthcare provider? Do they
Yeah.
tell them? And what barriers are there towards them getting safe sex? Because a lot of the research suggests people who are consensually non-monogamous, they are much better at getting tested. They think about these things and they get tested. They are more concerned and more concerned about safety and aware of the risks. So um, how how does that actually pan out if you have this group of people who are not necessarily open and do run the risk of stigma, and yet they're going and getting tested more than the general monogamous population? What are their experiences like? Is it fine or is it not?
Yeah, so you wrote an article, and this is actually how we discovered you. And you co-wrote this article with Christine Campbell, Associate Professor of Psychology at St. Mary's University in Twickenham. The title was, "It Made Me Feel Judged: Why It's Harder to Get Sexual Health Care If You Practice Consensual Non-Monogamy." And that was an article that we both read and related to quite a bit, because we've been in this conversation here lately amongst ourselves with whether or not to involve our family doctor,
Sure.
who is the same family doctor for both of us and happens to be a person we have somewhat of a personal relationship with as well, into our enjoyment in the lifestyle. And so we've had an ongoing conversation amongst ourselves about, are we better off to have that conversation with that doctor and include them in that element of our lives, or are we better off to utilize clinics and other healthcare providers specifically for sexual health, for testing, for things like that? And one of the big challenges for me in bringing this up with my doctor is this idea that you cannot unring the bell.
Yep.
I have a relationship with that doctor. I like that doctor for all the usual doctor reasons. And he knows people in our personal lives.
Right.
And I can tell him this, and he's a person who I actually anticipate will be good with that information, but I can't untell him that.
Yep.
And so one of the things that I'm interested in is the article goes into a lot of different directions, and we have a number of questions about all of them, but I guess I'm going to fast forward to the last one, and that is, do you have any advice for couples in your research?
Or individuals or singles even? Like
for anybody.
Like anybody.
What has been successful in terms of broaching that conversation with your doctor?
Right.
So that's a tricky one. I think I can't necessarily give research informed advice in terms of bringing it up with your doctor. But what I can talk about are some of the strategies that people have engaged with. And like you have said, that worry about, is it going to ruin that relationship? Others have brought this up, and I don't know your guys' situation, but particularly if you are in a small community, you worry about, if this person has this information, sure, they're a doctor, they're not meant to tell anyone, but small community, people's talk. So it can be a risk, or you can feel like a much larger risk. And so what people tend to do is, one, they might just come out to their doctor and it's fine. And they're, some people are even quite happy to do this. They don't want to be hiding, and they want knowledge and awareness of people having, group sex, threesomes, polyamorous relationships. They want that out in the world. They don't want to hide it, and they want awareness of that to sort of be there. So it can be almost a political thing to be out. Others lie. Others say, oh yeah, my partner's cheated on me. And so that is kind of the easiest way to get
Isn't that
the
crazy
that you need.
It's easier to say my husband or spouse cheated on me. I mean, like that's
it's
you're
shocking.
not wrong. It's amazing.
It's shocking to consider, and I understand it, but it's shocking to consider that saying to my doctor, well, my spouse cheats on me all the time, is
more
less
acceptable.
shameful
Yeah, right.
than I engage in consent. It's interesting because I think it's telling about, I hate to use the word like toxic society, but we're much more accustomed to people cheating on people than we are to consensual non-monogamy.
For sure, as well as if you say you have been cheated on, you take yourself out of the equation.
Yep.
You are painting yourself as the victim.
Right.
And so any stigma is kind of taken away from you.
So the approach is much more, well, let me do everything I can do to help you. And
So you're deflecting any sort of worry, and you're more likely to get sympathy than questions or grilling.
Of course, the downside to that is if these people know your partner or know your spouse. Then that's
next time you go to the doctor, he's gonna give you the look.
that isn't a good result,
right?
No, totally throw your partner under the bus there.
I'm changing doctors.
From a kind of more institutional perspective as well, when people go and if they say they've been cheated on or they just make up a story, I had a one night stand and I need XYZ tests, it kind of distorts the institution's perspective of who their patients are. And that might not seem like that matters, but it's important for medical establishment to know who they are treating and what their needs are in order to cater for their needs and actually provide them with the care that they need. So some of the people that we spoke to, well, I say spoke to, it was qualitative survey. So some of their responses were things like, oh, I didn't say anything until I was being withheld the care that I knew that I needed. And the interesting thing is a lot of these people feel that their knowledge of what they need and what they don't need, it tends to be much better than the doctors, or they at least perceive it to be better. They know the sorts of tests that they want. But oftentimes these requests are not met until the reason is kind of legitimized. And so then they'd be like, oh, I had to tell my doctor I'm polyamorous because otherwise they weren't going to give me this test.
Right.
And when they do, it can be good, it can be bad. So they run the risk, but it seems to be a lot of people won't necessarily out themselves until they are pushed. And getting the right care does seem to be of real paramount importance. So the fear around outing oneself seems to, when push comes to shove, it seems to take a backseat to, but I need these tests sort of no matter what. So you know what, I'm gonna.
Well, then it tends to invite more questions, and then it opens up the door for judgment, and then sometimes you may feel like you're kind of on the spot and you have to justify, and so I can appreciate that. Sometimes the less information you give initially is.
But the assumptions are harmful though too, because you had an experience recently with your OBGYN.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I was having I was getting a lot of UTIs, and it turned out long term I was having kidney stones. But it just so happened, it happened at the same time that we were engaging in some of these behaviors. And I remember going to my gynecologist because I was having all these UTIs, and I was worried that there was something else going on. And not once, I mean, she knew I was married. This doctor's office, I mean, I was married, I had my 2 kids, they delivered my kids, and so they knew all that. She never once asked me, have you had a new sexual partner? Yeah. She didn't ask, because in her mind, and again, I'm assuming that she assumed that, well, that's not an option.
Yeah. So it's an example where, to some extent, the ignorance and the assumption there limits that medical professional because they're not considering all of the available options.
And I also didn't feel comfortable in saying, could this be something related to this? Because I mean, part of it is, and so many factors lay into this. I mean, it's personality of the person, it's personality of the doctor's office. It's a very complicated thing to share that information with your medical provider. I mean, there's just a lot of pieces to it. But she didn't really invite it. I didn't feel comfortable asking and saying that and inviting those questions. She's not the most warm and fuzzy person, so it's, Yeah,
and that's really important, is feeling comfortable with who you're talking to. And I think this is why a lot of consensual consensually non-monogamous people seem to go to sexual health clinics who
Mhm.
deal with sexual health
Yep.
specifically, or LGBT focused
Yep.
sexual health clinics, because they think, well, these people see all sorts of things. It's their bread and butter. They are not going to be shocked if I say that I'm a swinger,
Well,
or that or
they're
had a gangbang or whatever.
right. They're known for being much more approachable and open-minded
Yeah.
about
Yep.
sex in general. So yes, I feel like I would 100% be more comfortable in going to an environment where I know they're kind of getting the quote unquote out of the norm, or
Hmm.
things that aren't vanilla,
Yeah,
for
yeah.
lack of better words. So yeah, it's, and they're probably asking those questions, or they're, you know, like there's more screening in that, maybe just involved, just the general questions that they may ask.
Yeah, I think there's I think there's very simple ways that they can kind of set these things up,
Yeah.
like general intake forms,
Yep.
like when you come in, and just standard questions. So, have you, or how many sexual partners have you had since your last visit?
Yeah.
And whether you are monogamous or non-monogamous, you can put your number. Now, that's not going to get the backup of anyone who has just had monogamous marriage, and it's only one or maybe zero sexual partners, depending on how long they've been married.
Well, they
But
usually ask, "Are you married?" They don't ask how many sexual partners. Yeah.
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 And so a
Right.
simple change in question, and they could garner a bit of that information in a way that kind of serves all populations
Hmm.
equally, but makes it better and actually gives them the information that would be useful.
Hmm.
So let me ask you this. So the article talks about, and I think what we're getting to is that it makes a ton of sense for medical students and even practicing physicians to be educated about alternative lifestyles and to be educated
Hmm.
about swinging and non-monogamy and polyamory and all these things. I guess a devil's advocate question that I might ask is, understanding that it's undeniably helpful if the doctor is familiar with these things and comfortable with these topics.
Yeah.
But should a physician, if one asked you, should that person make any effort to educate the patient about the sexual health risks that they are taking? Or should they essentially make the assumption that the patient is well aware of the risks that they're taking in an effort not to offend them?
Good question. I think probably the best way would be to offer in a sort of neither here nor there kind of manner. Just if someone says, okay, yeah, I'm non-monogamous, then offer, do you need any information, or would you like any information about potential risks and ways to minimize those risks? Just offer, the patient says yes or no. There's been no sort of judgment or assumptions made, but the offer has been made.
Yeah.
That would be my off the top of my head sort of approach. But yeah, I think it's a tricky one, and these things, we're not even sadly at the education stage, and I think theoretically quite a way off, given that you can't even guarantee that people are going to have decent LGBT plus education,
Well,
let
right. They're not.
alone
Yeah, they're not
yeah,
culturally competent there. Sure.
yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So let me ask you this: in the overall field of consensual non-monogamy as it relates to research,
Hmm.
is this a well-researched field in general? Is this something that there really is not a tremendous amount of research there about?
It's growing. It's very much in its infancy still. So I'd say the 1970s, there were a few studies about swinging, and then sort of a bit later on, a few bits and bobs about open relationships, relationship anarchy. I'd say it wasn't really until kind of early 2000s and maybe 2010 that research into consensual non-monogamy started to really kick off. So really, we're looking at, 14 years worth of research, which in academic terms is
It's
not a
nothing.
lot.
Yeah, it's nothing. Yeah.
Um, and a lot of the frames of reference that we have for these areas are limited still by kind of where we've come from. So most of the research, contemporary research on swinging or group sex, is all from the perspective of public health. So
Right.
where are the dangers? How do we minimize the dangers? Are these groups necessarily more dangerous? Are they? And so, baked into these questions are, well, they're having loads of sex. They must be
Well,
having
so
risky
are single
sex. So,
21-year-olds. Like,
Well, that was
Right,
that was an
right.
interesting thing. So,
You know?
in talking about this, as far as medical professionals, so we're saying that medical professionals should be more familiar with the lifestyle and what goes on and swinging and so forth. To lump that group in with the LGBTQ group, which is a slightly different circle, maybe under the alternative umbrella, right? And then you have horny 19-year-olds. The common factor between all these groups, the implied common factor is an increased risk of promiscuity, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that is element that binds us all together, right? That's why we're in this lump together. But I think to some extent, whether we're lifestylers or 19-year-olds, sex is sex from a medical standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And
I'm sure there's promiscuity going on in your white suburban, you know what I mean? Like, people are cheating on their spouses or like, I mean, it's not to even be categorized that way. It's just kind of a general, like, it's not.
Sure. So there's just an element of breaking down barriers about sex in general.
Well, that's, yeah.
That kind of does need to come. And, we're slowly chipping away and, having open conversations like this and being able to, self-publish, and the growth of podcasts and social networks and all of these things aid in our ability to have these conversations. You can sort of hear them and find out about what people are doing. But yeah, I would say a lot of the research about this area, it tends to be on understanding identities, about sexual risk, and more recently, in the last sort of 10 or so years, it started to more thoroughly explore stigma, and so the stigma against these various groups, and look at kind of attachment. And so what are people's kind of psychological makeup? And, there's been a little bit about healthcare, a little bit about how the kids do in polyamorous families. So yeah, it's kind of growing and flourishing, but there's still, plenty of areas where there's very little research. One, which is in the past couple of years started to come out, is looking at consensual non-monogamy in non-white populations. So for the longest time, it's been presumed that polyamory is a white thing. And I don't think it necessarily is. I think it just tends to be that it's maybe more a middle class thing. I think you need money and time to be able to do these things, to have sort of multiple partners. And so, there may be racialized elements within that, but this is just not an area that we have the research on to understand. So yeah, there's things that have been covered, but there's still so much more to learn and understand.
If we look back at the 60s and 70s as this sexual revolution, I mean, thankfully I wasn't around in the 60s and 70s, but
thankfully,
well, I'm not that old is what I'm getting at, but the, you hear about it, free love, and you get this impression that everybody is just out having sex with everybody and living in VW vans. Honestly, it sounds kind of fun. But would you say, based on your experience and research, that I'm going to call it the lifestyle, but swinging, consensual non-monogamy, would you say it is growing from that time, or it has shrunk from that time?
I think both. So I think there was a huge closing down of these things and a shrinking of these things during the 1980s with HIV and AIDS.
Oh, sure.
So that put a huge sexual panic in and kind of squashed these movements quite a lot. Post sort of 1980s, mid 1980s, I think these things start to come back, but I think swinging or the lifestyle, less so. I think this is, in many people's minds, it's sort of rooted in 1960s America, and it's not seen as necessarily a young person's thing. I think it has this image in some people's heads as being this older, more conservative thing. Now, I don't think that's necessarily true, but I think rather than turn to things like swinging and the lifestyle, you have seen a growth in things like open relationships and polyamory and these sorts of areas. I don't know. You guys are more on the ground and experienced than I am. What do you guys think?
I think it's, well, let's put it this way. I don't have a lot of empirical data or experience over a long period of time. But what I can tell you is that in the couple of years that we've gotten more involved with this, particularly since we started doing the podcast and we started doing social events,
well, we started
doing
talking
things,
to more people that may have potentially been in way longer than we have, right? I mean,
well, we're finding out there's more people involved in the lifestyle than we understood at the time.
Oh yeah,
sure.
So what I would say is that my experience is that there are a lot more people doing this than you think.
Mm-hmm.
That would be my answer.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But whether they want to label it or call it consensual non-monogamy or open marriages, or I mean, I think there's a lot of layers to it. The label, I think language is important in that, and labels matter. But I don't know how many people practice open marriages, but is that really a consensual thing?
There's so much to it. I mean, and whether or not, like we talked about in the beginning of the episode, having threesomes versus being a swinger. I personally, up until we just had that conversation, would not necessarily have made a distinction between those two things.
Sure.
Some people view I would say the purists, maybe
the purists
view being a.
We're clearly not the purists in this relationship.
Well, I think they view being a quote swinger as essentially the full swap scenario, and to a more aggrandized extent, the key parties. The big bowl with the punch bowl and the keys, and everybody fucks everybody.
Yeah. I mean, wife swapping, it's a very outdated term, but that's a connotation that can be sort of made in some people's heads, and it just feels outdated.
Right.
I'm not saying this is how it is, but this can be the kind of constructed image that people have.
Well, and I think this is where the labels become complicated. For example, a swinger might engage in threesomes, might engage in moresomes, might engage in full swap, might engage in. I would even consider, and this is actually why I kind of prefer the term lifestyle to swinger, which honestly is kind of semantics, but I like the term lifestyle better because for me, it doesn't have the more specific connotations of wife swapping and key parties and stuff.
Because that could potentially involve like a solo situation or.
Right.
Yeah.
And from a community standpoint, and I view this as a community, we have members of our group who have never physically engaged in anything. They would like to at some point. They're interested in it. They talk to us online and they're part of our online chat groups and things. But they haven't done anything yet. And they've said, oh, well, we're not really swingers. And I argue with that and say, really, you are. Because from my perspective, being a member of the lifestyle is more a mentality. It's more of an openness. It's more of a willingness than it is
actions
or a list of things you can say you've done or not done.
Sure. Yeah.
So I'm fascinated about your work, and I'm fascinated about the research in the field. One of the questions I had earlier was taking the assumption or the direction that the lifestyle is growing. Is it growing in a healthy way? And what guardrails are necessary to help it continue to grow in a healthy way? In a way that's not damaging to people, that's not damaging to relationships, that's not damaging to families and so forth?
Again, another good question. So I think probably I'm going to duck this one slightly. And I do have a colleague who I might be able to put you in touch with to talk about this. So another scholar who works around sort of the lifestyle and sex clubs and all of this kind of stuff in the UK. But I think there needs to be sort of good education. There needs to be good community and good support. And so a lot of the time people, you understand how to have a monogamous relationship. You see probably your parents were monogamous. You see it in kids' cartoons, movies, newspaper. It's everywhere. But the framework of how you do something differently isn't as readily there.
Right.
And so people need guidance. And whether that comes from books, like how many people who are consensually non-monogamous have ever read The Ethical Slut. It's, almost
The
like the
Ethical
Bible
Slut.
of this. Yeah.
I'll have to. Oh, The Ethical Slut. I'll have to read that.
I mean, it's a classic sort of book that people kind of read. It's almost like the poly Bible. So people read this, and it gives them ideas.
Well,
It gives
sure.
them a way to kind of move through the world.
But it almost
Um,
normalizes it, or it makes it real and makes
yeah,
it like you're not the only one feeling this way. Which I think is
yeah,
true. It's
yeah.
such a human thing. Anytime we have any experience and which makes us feel isolated, I think it's normal to seek out knowledge, right? And
Mhm.
something as simple as I got diagnosed with whatever, right? The first thing you're going to
Yeah,
do is Google it.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I think just being mindful that there are multiple ways to do things, but equally people are not necessarily they're not coming to it with the same natural awareness that they are with monogamy, that they are with two-person sexual relationships. So there needs to be sort of greater awareness and much more forethought and perhaps planning, thinking about what your desires are, what are those desires based in? Like, is there anything problematic about these
Yeah.
situations, or would be problematic for you or difficult for you? Are there sort of ideas, feelings? Jealousy is a typical one. How would you feel about seeing your partner have sex with someone else? Would you be jealous? What are you jealous of? Is that a feeling that you can overcome or twist into something like beneficial for you? Or maybe it's not a problem at all, but these are all kind of questions that you have to ask and think about because we're not encouraged to otherwise. So I think being aware of these things and that need for a better understanding that's probably one of the ways to think about growing in a kind of safe and progressive manner, as well as trying to avoid being overtaken by big corporations and twisted to, whatever
Well,
makes the most money.
there's always the moral argument too. I think everybody has this belief that it's this immoral, just what's the word? Just,
Oh, it's a
a
sin.
sexual deviant. Yeah, that's what I've
Yeah.
heard. And it's such a deviant behavior. And
Hmm.
I kind of, we joke about this, but it's like, I feel like our relationship is healthier than a lot of other people that are completely monogamous. I mean, and I'm not saying
Yeah.
non-monogamy is why we're healthier necessarily, but
No,
But it hasn't harmed
it
us.
hasn't harmed it. Right. And if
yeah.
anything, it has strengthened our relationship in some way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think many of the fundamental cornerstones that allow people to go out and have group sex and have multiple romantic partners, it's open communication,
Yep.
it's honesty, it's trust. All of these things apply equally to monogamous relationships. If you have those things in a monogamous relationship, it's got the bedrock of being a good
Sure.
relationship. Yeah.
We can't wait to hear about what you're studying next.
So I've got a few pots on the boil. Currently looking at trying to get a study up and running about how attitudes change over time. So looking at kind of a general population and looking at, okay, where do your perceptions of consensual non-monogamy come from? And then tracking them over time to see, okay, do their opinions change? Do they soften as they sort of get older and mature? Do they stay the same? And what impacts that? So maybe they have a very middling opinion, and then a friend comes out to them who's had an open relationship, and maybe they become more positive, or maybe their friends cheated on in a threesome or whatever, and
Right.
maybe it
Sure.
goes down. So kind of exploring the sources of people's both positive and negative opinions. But yeah, that is kind of what I am working on at the moment.
I feel like I could speak for the scheduling sin community, and we will volunteer to be some of your research
Oh my gosh.
participants.
I could just hear all of our listeners right now throwing their hands up.
I want to do it. I want to do it.
Well,
study me.
we and I realize it sounds like you're talking about the opinions of folks exterior to the lifestyle, but
Yeah.
we talk about for ourselves this evolution that happens within it. And you mentioned in the beginning are threesomes a slippery slope to full on swinging? And I think maybe in some cases they are, but more specifically, what we have found, and so many people have echoed this, is this idea that in the beginning, another couple we talked to said the same thing. We had all the rules in the beginning. We will not do this. We will not look them in the eye. We will not know their name. We will not talk to them afterwards. We want nothing to do with these people, and that might have been day one. And as we have gone on in this, we have, solo play is a perfect example. In the beginning, we said we would never do that. Well, sure enough, we have. But those attitudes do change just through experience and through getting more comfortable with things.
But also having different experiences and learning what you are not comfortable with and what you're more comfortable with than you thought, and what you can get comfortable with. And I mean, it's a lot of.
Well, and I think humans are naturally progressive people, in the sense that, okay, I've done this step. Now I want to do the next step. Now I want to do the step after that. It seems to me, there's almost always that growth pattern. And it is interesting to me, actually, that people would have threesomes, and it never goes any further than that. I actually find that really interesting, because it seems to me like most people who are successful at it are going to want at least to do it again.
Well, I think that depends on the personality. I think you, sir, like to continue. You are a very progressive person in that, like, you are very much like, well, I did this. Now I can do this, or now I can do this. And I don't know if that's everybody's personality.
How many people can I fit in here?
Well, right. You're like, I put it here. What can I put it here?
I think it depends on what some of the initial motivations for a threesome are. So for some people, just having a threesome would be in itself the progression, but it's not a progression of them having sex. It's a progression of them more as a person. So a number of people talked about, I'd wanted to tick it off.
It's like a checkbox or something they want to do.
Wanted to tick it off. I've done that. I had a really interesting interview with a young guy who spoke about, I think he had a threesome when he was 16, 17, and he said to himself, now I'm 18, I've gone to university, I'm an adult, I need to sort of grow up and stop doing these things. And I was like, wow, that's a really interesting way of
it's really interesting, because we went the complete opposite.
We went the other way. Well, let me ask you this though, and this is something I wonder about in this vein, is imagine you go back to a sexual partner that you had maybe at a younger time in your life or something. Your first sexual experiences with that person are often fumbly. They're uncomfortable. Maybe you don't necessarily know what the other person likes, and vice versa. Your first sexual experience with someone is almost never as good as it would be later, right? And I wonder how many people have experiences that are ones that you have fantasized about for a tremendous amount of time. A threesome, an orgy, a gangbang, public sex, group sex, same room sex, full swap, etc.
You rattle those off pretty quick.
I had a list. But you have all these things and you really want to do them, and they're fantasies and you love the idea, and then you go have that experience. But it's the first time that you're having that experience, and potentially the first time you're having that experience with those people. And it may be fun, it may be great, but it doesn't live up to the fantasy. And not because the threesome wasn't good, not because an orgy isn't good, not because a gangbang isn't good. It's because it was the first time. And so I wonder how many people, to your point, to go tick it off, they go have a threesome and they walk away from going, well, that was okay, but it really wasn't that great. I don't need to do it again.
I think it's all about expectations, because I think sometimes people have experiences that you may, like, if you stop and think and like critique, but I think sometimes people's expectations going in, I think, are very different.
Well, sure, it's a fantasy meets reality, right? But so the person has the threesome, they say, well, okay, well, I guess I ticked the box. It wasn't that great. I don't need to do it again. No. You should definitely do it again. But I wonder how many people don't ever make that connection, that this is a thing that it's like anything. It has to happen more than a few times to get really good.
And it's so funny. That's exactly kind of a thing that came up, and it was quite gendered in the fact that men often were disappointed and women were pleasantly surprised because men would come in thinking this is going to be the best, it's going to be
Oh,
awesome,
sure.
and it didn't hit, whereas women would often go in thinking, not sure about this.
Right,
I'm sort of a
right.
bit worried. How am I going to be treated? Like, especially if it's two guys, am I just going to be this object and they're not cool with that? And a lot of them would come out being like, actually, no, it's all right. And so, yeah, but I don't think anyone, yeah, did make that connection that, yeah, it's the first time you're doing it. Of course, you're probably going to be bad and it will only get better.
Right. Well, I can think we can. I mean, it's funny, like because we've had threesomes, we've had a number of them. Not like we're kind of whorish now that I stop and think about it, but but
You
we.
say it like it's a bad thing.
Well, no, it's not. It's not. We're whorish, right? Like it's better. But no, like we've had threesomes. We've had like one threesome with like a specific couple, but then we've had multiple with another. Do you know what I mean? And so I think even the progression of the people that we have played with multiple times,
They get better.
they get better. Yeah.
We have one in particular. It happens to be a male that we've played with now 4 or 5 times.
Yeah.
And it has consistently gotten better every time.
Right.
For all the predictable reasons. You know, everybody
Yeah.
understands better what everybody wants and so on and so forth. And it just continues to get better. And so I'm wondering, or just curious, how many people tick the box, so to speak, and walk away without realizing that they.
It's like you feel so bad for them. You're like, do it again.
I know.
Do it again.
I do. That's really what it's rooted in. Is I just feel badly for them.
Yeah. And I also wonder, it's not something that came up, but I can imagine if you see threesomes as a prospect with potential risk, either risk to your partner, and if you have a relationship, or risk to friendships, and sort of you've had it, if it came off okay, there's that idea of, okay, well, I did it, I avoided the bad stuff, I've avoided that risk. Going back again, could I hit that risk that time? Could I hit that bad thing that time? And so
Sure.
there's almost a got away with it
Sure.
kind of
Yeah.
mindset of,
Yeah.
yeah, well, I did it and it was okay. Ooh, let's move on.
Yeah. It is amazing. And I think really what all of this illustrates is just how differently people approach all of this.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
You know, there are so many, kind of like you talked about in the beginning, that there is it's almost impossible to identify trends because there's so much diversity.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of what I was glad that I could find in my research on threesomes. And I've done various media interviews, and I've always tried to push this element of there's not a singular type of person and there's not a singular type of experience. We
Yeah.
shouldn't have this image in our head of those are people who have threesomes and that is what a threesome looks like, because it's just not the case. And so when people hold particularly like stigmatized images or ideas about people who have these experiences or have this sort of sex, they shouldn't, because it's so different, and we should recognize that nuance and that complexity just like we would in other areas of humanity and life. But somehow with sex we often put it in a box or have very strict ideas about it.
So let me ask you this last question. You started off this thesis when you did your PhD based on a personal experience, and you went to scholarly research and felt that you personally were not very well identified in those writings.
Mm-hmm.
You did this study.
Yep.
What did you learn about yourself?
I mean, I've never been asked this before. Of all of the interviews I've done, yeah, I've not been asked, so I don't think I've reflected that deeply upon it. What did I learn about myself? I think first and foremost that I think right. I was right to sort of do this research, and I feel like I'm perhaps one of the right people to be doing this research because I'm very comfortable to talk about it. I don't mind the sort of the stigma that comes my way from talking about it and from being open and being like, oh, you're Dr. Threesome. I can sort of happily laugh that off. And, that's fine. That's a sort of moniker that I don't mind having. So I think it may be confirmed to myself, but yeah, this is a good place to be. And I can be a mouthpiece for people who perhaps are not able to be comfortable speaking about these things themselves. I think I probably learned my sex life is a lot more vanilla than other people.
That's all
But
right. We don't. We welcome all.
yeah. No, thank you. And yeah, I think it's the diversity in people's sex and relationship experiences. I think it makes you feel sort of like, although we have this idea of how a relationship should be and what a framework should be, I think it makes you think about, well, you've got all of these ideas and all of these frameworks, but what you should really be doing is thinking about what is right for you and taking those bits that work for you and that you want to do. And, if you think about marriage, so me and my sort of current partner, now wife, we just ran away and got married.
Yeah.
We were like, that works for us. That's what we want to do. So we're going to do it. And, we took bits of the marriage that we wanted to do, got rid of the bits we didn't want to do.
Yeah.
And, that's what works for us. And that's kind of how we should be. And yeah, I think looking at people's diverse experiences and the various ways that people can make it work, it encourages you yourself, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, and I think it's really kind of cool that I can really appreciate when you say I'm the right type of person to do this, because I mean, I think I'm in a setting in my profession that I feel like I have some opportunities to do certain things like research or those things, but I very much shy away from, because not that I'm embarrassed by it, but I worry about the implications in the other professional settings I am in.
Yep.
And so I can appreciate that.
Yeah. Whereas, I know there will be colleagues who look at my work and think, what's the point? Like,
oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, but don't get it, that have various assumptions about who I am, what I do, all of those things. And you know what? If you do research in this kind of area, you will get those. And that's just part of the landscape. And, if it allows me to spread critical thinking and get people to think more broadly about things, and that's a small hit, but I'm happy to take in my own life if I can hopefully make the world better, more tolerant, and more open to thinking about different ways of doing things for other people. Yeah, like that's a well worth trade-off.
Yeah, no, I get that.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
It was so wonderful to talk to you. And
no, thank you for having me.
We want to hear from you. Email us at snowmilf@yahoo.com. That's SNOMILF@yahoo.com. You can also join us on our Discord and have some fun interactive conversations with us. The link is in the show notes. Talk to you soon.